we have to use the microphone? Or okay. Okay. Should we start? You put it here? Yeah, yeah. You can hear me now? Yeah. Yes, I know, but I didn't print it. Should I print it? No.
Room 2? Yes.
Welcome to the session on transformations in teaching and learning. We have, you can't? I can't. You have a headset? You need a headset. If you,
You all have to have a headset. The sound, you can get it just in front of you.
okay, while waiting for the rest to have a headset, can we start now? We can start now, yeah. The basic skills acquired over time through purely theoretical academics does not suffice anymore. It just provides a mere foundation. With the world transforming at an unprecedented rate, you need more in order to aim higher. This means adopting new approaches to solve real-life problems in multiple disciplines, utilizing a broad spectrum of tools and techniques in education. The paradigm shift demands organizations to prioritize education that can enable professional progress with a competitive advantage. The trends of the rapidly changing industries in the age of data and technology require institutions to adapt their academic curriculum, co-curricular programs, and corporate linkages to new players, shifting mandates, local trends, evolving partnerships, and governance structures. At a time when we have increased access to information, how are teaching, pedagogy, and learning models changing? Should higher education institutions today prioritize student-centered learning and stimulate self-directed and problem-based learning to better prepare students for societal changes? The aim of this session is to discuss the transformations in teaching and learning to enhance the quality and relevance of higher education. We now have three very knowledgeable panels. Unfortunately, I have originally 4 panels, but 2 has backed off for reasons that reasons of their own. But then I have Professor here, Mandla, who has kindly agreed to be on the same panel. So first I will be introducing my panel, and then I'll give them the floor for their presentation, and then we will have some time for the question and answer. I would request my panel to please limit your presentation no more than 15 minutes. I will be allowing you a minute or 2, but after that, I'm sorry, I have to bang the table. Okay then, so our first speaker will be Dr. Tolga Turker. He is the program director for Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and Russia. He is connected with the University of Arizona Global in USA. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Cincinnati, and before relocating to Arizona, he was an associate professor of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Istanbul Arel University. So I'm giving the floor to Dr. Tolga, and he will be talking about the transformation of higher education using the digital technology. I feel so awkward because it looks like, can you hear me? I feel so awkward. So, Tolga, please.
Do I use this? Okay. Thank you, Professor. I'd like to start by thanking first the organization committee at IAU as well as our host institution. Thank you very much. I feel privileged to be here. The contribution of higher education institutions to development and transformation is a theme that has attracted increasing attention in recent years. Currently, it is expected that the knowledge institutions, the universities, not only conduct education and research, but also play an active role in the development of their economic, social, and cultural surroundings. In other words, we are entrusted with a mission. In spite of the fact that the contribution of higher education is on the policy agenda for some time, it remains far from clear how the institutions actually function and what their new responsibilities will entail. Nor there is a consensus as to what standing collaboration with industry, community, and the governments should have in their overall operation and which priorities are relevant. The discussions are pretty much surrounded around these certain metaphors. Some central metaphors seem to recur when higher education and development and transformation are under discussion. To begin with, we have the machinery metaphors. Higher education acts as an engine, powerhouse, driver, dynamo, booster, and so on and so forth. This wording suggests that this is where the pace is set for the progress. The other type of metaphor is biological. Higher education represents a hothouse, seedbed, a catalysis or a fermenter for transformation and development. And these concepts engender associations with something that sprouts and then blossoms. And this is the place for innovation and reinvigoration. And the third set of metaphors center on the networks. Higher education constitutes a hub, a bridgehead, a mediator, a coupling unit, and so on and so forth. Here, the access to and the dissemination of information and knowledge are emphasized. And the final type is the time metaphor, which suggests that the institutions of higher education take the lead in a transformation process. They herald and symbolize a new era. Terms like spearhead, vanguard, lighthouse, and signpost are used. And all these metaphors thus provide definitions of reality and tell us something about the character and role of the higher education institutions. So in this presentation, I would like to get behind these metaphors and take a closer look on how higher education is being transformed as a result of digital technology. More than 6 million students participate in online courses, educational degrees, and other learning opportunities offered by a variety of educational institutions. The recent rise of online education creates the possibility of expansion of higher education structure, knowledge, and influence around the world. And with this opportunity comes a responsibility of examining the purpose and accessibility and delivery of online higher education. The question is this proliferation of educational opportunities an asset for those who may in the past not have had access to expanding education globally, or is it a pathway for some sort of hegemony, creating a dominant pedagogy? Throughout the history, traditionally, access to higher education has been available predominantly to those with the social and economic means to attend courses on a college or a university campus. As technology advanced in the 20th century, radio and television joined the textbooks as popular delivery platforms for distance education programs. And amidst the public outcry for well-trained workforce in the 1960s, universities promoted new educational opportunities via independent correspondence courses, with the primary beneficiaries of this accessibility expansion remaining the dominant university student population, as opposed to non-traditional students historically excluded from higher education. Technology advances in the decades leading up to the 21st century opened the door to creative pedagogical approaches, including incorporation of the internet and electronic learning management systems as a means for delivering programs. And these advances corresponded with a decline in government financial support for higher education. With momentum from the software development and internet infrastructure expansion, distance education shifted toward becoming largely a digital immersion. In the early 21st century, massive open online courses constituted an emerging experimental pedagogical structure intended to weave together open access principles with digitally immersed instruction. These MOOCs were designed to achieve accessibility that had until that time not been possible until digital infrastructure connected global networks. By 2016, there were 5.8 million students engaged in some form of distance learning, including online education, and this represents a 263% increase in the number of online students from 2002 and onwards. 77% of higher learning institutions providing online courses and programs report incorporating online learning into their institutional long-term strategies. A key shift in the power balance in society, and therefore the higher education over the past few decades, has been the strengthening of the neoliberal trends in economy, including the free market, globalization, deregulation, and restructuring of the institutional systems to meet the perceived need for student consumers. Prior to the influence of neoliberalism, higher education was viewed as a public good, which benefited society overall. Public funding and support were perceived as investment in future financial and mobility currency, stemming from the higher salaries and revenues consistent with the educated workforce. As neoliberalism has extended into education, public opinion increasingly has viewed higher education institutions as incapable of incorporating cost-saving measures without resulting in a substantial impact on the quality of education. Accompanying the shift towards neoliberalism has been the growing perception that higher education primarily benefits the private individual, and therefore public funding cuts over recent decades have purposefully shifted the cost of higher education to the individual student, while state appropriations for higher education have evolved as uncertain and unstable. At the same time, higher education tuition has exceeded inflation increases over the past several decades, leaving the students more reliant on tuition discounts and financial aid. Also, the recruitment efforts to compete for students beyond the traditional borders of the university have acted as an indicator for the higher cost of higher education. Higher education institutions today increasingly tend to employ contractual part-time faculty, thereby avoiding hiring and employment costs present with the tenure-track faculty. From 1970 to 2007, during the time frame associated with the shift in neoliberalism, the average percentage of the full-time faculty decreased from 80% to 51.3% in institutions of higher education. So with the transition to neoliberal efficiency, online courses are now viewed as advantageous because they tend to be developed in a universal structure conducive to attainment of employment skills while being delivered in a consistent manner by different, often part-time instructors. While this is a highly cost-effective strategy, the technology underlying online courses does not automatically accommodate the needs of students with diverse learning styles without significant changes that will require a new allocation of resources. The use of technology in higher education is not only taken for granted, but is also typically encouraged and promoted because research has shown that the application of digital technology has enhanced teaching and learning. Many studies agree and argue that the use of digital technology could potentially stimulate technical literacy, social interaction, and critical reflection. This positive potential of the use of technology in higher education has found prominence in various educational policies of governments and of universities. The transformative power of digital technology for higher education is similarly widely acknowledged. Also, some studies point out that technology continues to shape internationalization of higher education. Internationalization can, in turn, broaden the discourse of transformation and encourage the rethinking and analytical analysis. There are, of course, concerns among the critics about the use of technology in higher education and of its positive transformative potential. Such concerns include issues of cost effectiveness, the relative benefit of digital technologies, issues of access and equity, digital literacy as an isolated technological skill, and so on and so forth. Other challenges include increased plagiarism, loss of focus or scattered attention by the students, uncertainty of the role of education, and so on and so forth. Despite some of these concerns about the use of digital technology in higher education, the vast majority of research literature on this matter is positive about its use and potential. But my goal here is not to oppose this positive assessment of digital technology, but rather to encourage critical engagement with questions regarding the understanding and use of technology in higher education. Currently, the dominant philosophy in the use of digital technology is the instrumentalist view, which is typical of and derived from the approaches of pragmatism and social constructivism. Such approaches, in my opinion, cannot adequately and encompassingly describe the engagement between the individual and the technological artifact because of their inability to trace embediment with this relation. This unfortunate result is that the full human experience in this process is lost, and the focus is shifted solely to the artifact, the object. In the context of higher education, it means that the student's experience in the use of digital technology is lost or seen as totally abstract, as if it is separated from his or her body. Instrumental approaches inherently presume that individual experience of this contemporary form of technology is numbed. The lived experience of the individual is disregarded. The phenomenon becomes cold, and to borrow a term from the Marxist terminology, it is alienating. Because technology is increasing the use in higher education, this question of relevancy and alienation becomes highly pertinent in and for this context. So, to wrap my simple question: what is university? It has become difficult to describe what university is nowadays, but I can give you a more traditional sense of what we mean by university. University was a place where knowledge was sought for its own sake, where the lecturers and the professors had a stable identity embedded in a specific discipline and tradition. The university followed the long term in preference for the short term, the theoretical above the practical, the disinterested before the useful. If the academic endeavors led to the practical improvements, these were mainly non-intended results. The issue of application was left to subsequent initiatives by others. So in that sense, academic life should be carried out in isolation from social and economic interests. But today, this is not the case anymore, and the higher education is faced with much broader and much diverse student clientele than ever before. The students are not oriented towards socialization into cultural elite, but are chiefly oriented towards obtaining useful skills and knowledge for a patchwork of jobs. A growing population of students are adults, working and part-time students, and thanks to the digital transformation, they are increasingly acting as demanding customers. There's also a growing sense of public unease with the academic autonomy, which is regarded as a pretext for avoiding social responsibility. Most countries currently reforming their higher education systems and governance arrangements to enhance the efficiency and accountability, to get more value for money and assure that the institutions are able to deliver the goods. They are decentralizing responsibilities while monitoring results. The institutions of higher education are, for their part, involved in an ever fiercer competition for bright students, high-quality staff, and research funding. And the competition is enhanced by many factors such as increasing consumer sovereignty, new information and communication technology, which provides an abundance of information and is changing the modes of delivery, the entrance of for-profit providers in education, and so on and so forth. The race is further escalating as each institution responds by concentrating their efforts, profiling and branding studies, developing alliances, franchising operations, hiring faculty stars, running fundraising campaigns, extending student amenities, and so on. Hence, the education is turning into a global business. The same happens with research, where the research universities put high stakes on the production and the sale of intellectual property, contract research, and capturing of research grants. Some see this as a sign of a crisis in higher education. The declining faith in the university idea marks the advent of academic capitalism. The university has surrendered to the market. They foresee the university is in ruins, and some see this as the price that higher education necessarily has to pay for becoming a multiversity. Multiversity in the sense that an organization that performs great variety of new functions and receive large amounts of public money. Nevertheless, I think we can all agree to some extent that we are witnessing a period of profound changes. We are not only embracing recruitment, funding, and new technologies, but the institutional environments that govern the research and education efforts and the identities of the higher education institutions. So, in this new context, it will be more up to us to create our own future. our destiny will, to a large extent, depend upon the strategic choices and the local abilities to upgrade the curricula, develop new areas of research, and to build alliances. And the bottom line is we have to be entrepreneurial. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tolga. So he has discussed the disadvantage and advantage of using technology. We can use technology to support traditional modes of teaching, but then it will not encourage critical thinking.
Some say that, yes.
Okay, all right, so we go to the next speaker, Dr. Craig. Dr. Craig is a professor of James Madison University. Oh, what's coming next? Is it you? Yeah. And he's an executive director of the International Beliefs and Value Institute in the U.S. He has service activities and partnerships with individuals and organizations in the United States, and including Cultivating and Globally Sustainable Self, a multi-year, multi-institution summit series. He will be talking about the human side of this transformation of teaching and learning. So I give the floor to you, Professor.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me on this mic here? Great. Let me just double check this thing. Okay. Well, whoops. Which way am I going here? Wrong way. Oh, you're seeing my presentation. Can you start this at the beginning again? So, this little magic stick here. Okay, well, I'm gonna hopefully just hit it once and it'll work. I also want to thank IAU leadership, our host institution, for this honor to be with you all today. I think the IAU is one of the more fascinating global institutions and organizations because it's the whole world. And all of us in higher education need to be looking there, I think. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you also to my colleagues, the chair, for this opportunity. So I am going to be taking a little bit of a different approach here. I am a clinical psychologist in recovery, I like to say. And the reason I say in recovery is because most often these days, I'm talking to audiences that are not psychologists. And I'm in a constant learning mode, which is delightful. So undoubtedly people will come up and say, hey, do you know so-and-so or this and that? And I will say, no. Will you please send me an email about that? And that's, again, part of the delight of being in a place like this. So I'm going to be talking in 15 minutes about 25 years of research and practice. Let's see if I can pull this off. There'll be contact information and information at the end if you'd like to explore a bit more about some of these themes. I'm just going to give you a heads up. We're going to be looking at some data. So if you're not a data person, I'm going to try to translate that into something that is as accessible as possible. So just giving you that heads up as we go along. So within and beyond higher education and really all over the world, there's a pressing need to re-examine our assumptions about the processes and outcomes of teaching and learning. Our prevailing models remain anchored in delimiting notions of who we are as human beings, what it is that we need in order to learn, grow, and develop, and what's necessary for us truly to cultivate globally sustainable selves. That concept itself we'll be coming back to. Such perspectives and aspirations are at the very core of pursuing and enacting the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. I'm thinking about Professor Carrie Facer's talk this morning, where and a lot of what I talk about are these sort of from her framework, would be the epistemological and the mythical levels of analysis, even though those relate to material and structural levels, because those are comprised of humans, right? So the interdependence of these things is a lot of what we focus on. So these kinds of contentions that we have to rethink how it is that we understand who we are and how that relates to learning and growth and change. They may seem abstract, but actually they're based on data gathered from all over the world over the past couple decades. We have a data set now over 60,000 people using a measure called the Beliefs, Events, and Values Inventory, or BEVI, from cultures and countries all over the globe. These data demonstrably illuminate why, how, and under what circumstances teaching and learning are or are not aligned with who we are and what we need in order to achieve our potential. And so I'm going to be showing you what I mean by that. Overall, our findings illustrate that human beings are not first and foremost rational or cognitive beings, but deeply emotional and needful creatures who learn best when these fundamental aspects of self are understood by those who are entrusted to teach. It's a very different frame than kind of the Greek-Roman notion, male, Western kind of idea of who we are as a species. So the differences among us as learners will not and cannot be understood solely or primarily in cognitive terms. I'm saying that to you as a clinical psychologist who does testing and training and this kind of thing with doctoral students. Our data indicate that what we demonstrate in terms of traditional benchmarks of learning, for example, language acquisition, are profoundly mediated. They're influenced or shaped by a wide range of internalized beliefs and values, such as how we experience gender, culture, and emotion. So these internalized ideas that we have about self, other, and the larger world that we get from our development, from our culture, from our context, from our gender, from all of these what we call formative variables, influence the kinds of typical benchmark categories that we look at, grades, English acquisition, for example, depending on the context, and on and on and on. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. These are data from looking at some of the scales on this measure, the BEVI that I mentioned, gender traditionalism, sociocultural openness, ecological resonance, and global resonance. The scale, what the scale measures on the BEVI is summarized by the name that you see before you. If you have an intuitive understanding of that, you get a pretty good idea of what we've measured. I don't have time to get into the psychometrics and all the test development stuff on the BEVI, but I would be delighted to talk with you. It's all publicly available if you have those questions. What you're seeing here is that language acquisition is actually mediated by the degree to which people are open and interested in cultures that are different from their own. The highest degree, high advanced English acquisition, low advanced, and then high intermediate are associated with the degree to which people are actually open to and interested in cultures that are different from their own. What that suggests to us is that if we're only trying to teach people whatever it is we're trying to teach them, knowledge and skills like we'll learn the language, that it actually what may be causing the changes or the acquisition capacity to occur or not to occur may have nothing to do with the skill of the English teacher. It may have to do with things that are internalized within the individual that are interacting with the educational experience itself to produce these kinds of measurable outcomes. Okay? So the degree to which, another point here, the degree to which we are open to cultures that are different from our own is determined in no small part by our life histories, our backgrounds, and fundamental psychological characteristics, such as basic openness, critical thinking, emotional capacity, and self-awareness. To my mind, the SDGs are one of the greatest achievements of humankind. Getting countries around the world, scholars, educators, activists, leaders, together over a multi-year period and decade period really leading up to that is stunning, astounding. But with all due respect, in my humble opinion, many of the SDGs do not have an adequately sophisticated understanding of human psychology and what actually is responsible for whether we're going to value female human beings Why is that they are or are not valued? These are fundamentally psychological issues. They have to do with cultural variables, religious variables, economic variables that are internalized by us that create the problem in the first place. So my point is that if we want to really tackle the SDGs and transform higher education, we have to at least include these kinds of perspectives in our policy, in our education, in our thinking about how to solve these problems. And I'm going to show you some heavy-duty data here, so please don't leap up and run out of the room. This is called a structural equation model. Do I have any statisticians in the room? Darla, I see you over there. Statisticians in the room? Well, I can say anything up here then. You have no way to know if I'm being truthful. All right, well, so what this frightening looking thing is, it's actually very basic. It's a statistical predictive model that draws upon statistical methodologies like regression and path analysis to take a theory. This would be an idea you have about how human beings work or how the world works, and then evaluate it. That's what it does. So what we're seeing here is this thing that's got mediator written over it called sociocultural openness is heavily predictive of the interest that human beings have in international learning, multicultural experiences, and so forth. That better be the case if it's a valid measure. It better predict that, and it does. But where it really gets interesting is that the degree of sociocultural openness that people say they have is actually heavily influenced by the life histories people have. Think of our own president in the United States. I'm not making a political statement. I'm not. I'm making a statement about human beings in general, right, left, and all in between. A negative degree of life events, being non-white, people who are white like me, tend to be less socioculturally open than people who are not. Why? Because if you're in a majority culture and you're a minority person, you have to know more about the majority culture than the majority culture has to know about you, which is why it's probably associated with a greater degree of sociocultural openness. And finally, and interestingly, a higher degree of mother's education, but not father's, is associated with a higher degree of sociocultural openness in offspring, children. Fathers, by the way, higher degree of education by fathers is associated with a lower degree of gender traditionalism by male and female offspring. We don't have time to get into why that is, but it sure is interesting, isn't it? All right, and it has direct implications for the SDGs. So teachers also differ greatly in their capacity and inclination to apprehend and address human complexity. We've seen that over and over again, which manifests in differential outcomes in terms of student learning, growth, and development. For example, these are two teachers who are teaching what is supposed to be the same exact class. And you're seeing that, and for all intents and purposes, these students were randomly assigned to these classes, these two classes. At time 1, time 2 levels, they have dramatically different outcomes by their students, right? So what you find with teacher 1 there on the left is that the perception of my own life events 3 months after the beginning of the course has gotten more negative. You might think that's a bad thing, but actually it also means it's also associated with a higher degree of self-awareness and a higher degree of interest and engagement with cultures that are different from your own. Instructor 2 shows a substantial lowering of negative life events from time 1 to time 2, but a significant drop also in self-awareness and global engagement. This is the same required course with very different outcomes. What that suggests to us, if we're interested in transforming education, we have to pay attention to the quality of teaching and how we learn the art and craft of doing this work over time. Higher education institutes and their student bodies often are remarkably different, which can affect everything. And the problem is that if institutions and instructors don't know this about their students, here's two institutions. One is a highly internationalized liberal arts college on the left. The other is a comprehensive university that focuses on teaching engineers. These are students before they've even taken their first class. You don't have a background yet in what I'm looking at, but it's kind of like The Matrix, if you've seen that movie and the stuff comes down the screen. If you've seen hundreds, if not thousands of these, you're like, oh, okay, that's what that means. What I'm looking at are those causal closure, basic determinism scales. What this means is that the engineering students, before they've even taken a single class, are much less able to think in complex complex terms. Okay? That doesn't make them bad. It just means that that's how they're organized when they're sitting before us in a classroom, and it's important for us to know that. Students who look alike in terms of gender, ethnicity, or who share similar backgrounds or identities, economic, religious, may actually be very, very different. So we can't assume that people, just by the way they look, that they represent a particular class or a group of people. Here's an example of a scale on the bevy for a group of students who all self-selected into a learning community that focuses on international competencies, being more open-minded. So you'd think, well, gee, they're all, well, look at this. This scale measures how religious people are. And what you find, this is what we call a bimodal distribution. This group of 25 young people has completely different views on the nature of religion, its role in their life. There's atheists, agnostics down at the left-hand side, and very devout people of faith on the right-hand side. We're about to teach all of them together, and the question is, do we understand that about them in terms of teaching and learning? So the final point at this research level is that if we're going to try to teach sustainable development, we must cultivate globally sustainable selves. And in that, we can't have one without the other. We have to think of these together. These data show that. They show that a high degree of ecological resonance, interest in the environment, is associated with, for example, a degree of openness to one's own emotional world. It's the degree to the ability to hold complexity. So the reasons why people are interested in the SDGs or not don't have anything to do with the logic of being interested in the SDGs. And we won't win them over by rational arguments alone. We have to recognize the interacting nature of life history and how people really work fundamentally. So 5 principles as I wrap up. First, if we truly want to transform higher education for the future, we must transform our understanding of who we are as a species. Second, as educators, scholars, and leaders, we must attend much more to human context, culture, development, emotions, and values, and not privilege only the acquisition of knowledge and skills. The imbalance on focusing on knowledge, rational knowledge, spitting back facts, that's a massive imbalance, and it's not helping us in terms of what the species needs at this point in time to be responding to the issues that are before us. Third, we should focus on process as much as content, particularly when dealing with controversial issues. I have a student who did her dissertation on this point, that when multicultural educators try to guilt people into coming around to the other side, the problem is it shuts down access. And so I'm in agreement with the values, but the process is what matters most. Fourth, we need to assess where our learners are, not where we think they should be. Where are they actually? Not where we think they ought to be, and meet them there and work with them there. And then fifth, we need to explore why we believe what we believe, not so much what we believe. That's interesting, but the real interesting question is, why is it that we have the beliefs and values we do in the first place? So we've developed a measure. I've alluded to that. It has these different domains over the past 25 years. That's what we've done. We've got this crazy model of how human beings actually work at this level. Where do beliefs and values come from? How are they influenced by all these factors and forces, what we call formative variables? How are human needs? You may have heard of someone like Abraham Maslow, for example. Well, there are needs theorists all over the world. And the model that we work with has 9 needs, from basic appetitive needs through attachment needs. You may have heard of attachment needs, for example, all the way up to attunement needs. And you'll notice there's human attunement, and there's attunement to the natural world. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests us as a species, we are actually responsive to what's going on in the natural world, other creatures, which may seem like a no-brainer to the people in the room here, but from a scholarly perspective and demonstrating that empirically, it takes a lot of work. And so these are among the things that we work on. Finally, we've got this notion of these 7 Ds. People often ask me, what have you learned about change? The 7 Ds are what we've learned. How long is an experience? How different is the experience from what the learner is used to? What is the depth of the capacity that the learner has to actually change? That's a psychological variable that influences outcomes. How well do we determine who our audience is? whether we're teaching or taking them abroad or whatever we're doing, or politicians, whoever they may be? How well do we design our intervention, taking these human variables into account? How well do we deliver it? How skillful are we at delivering what it is that we say we're going to deliver? And finally, how well do we debrief before, during, and after the intervention? The 7 Ds are what we have learned. So I'm going to stop by pointing out these. This PowerPoint, I'm sure, will be made available. You can read more about all this stuff. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me, there's my Gmail account. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Interesting. We have learned the human side. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Mandla Makania. We had a project earlier, 3 years ago, with the IIEP, I believe, on quality assurance. Professor Makania is from Durban and started his schooling at Sinamuva Catholic School in Tongat. I would say, I was telling him earlier, you're very notorious when you were a student. He has several suspensions and expulsions, but then look at him right now. Okay, he holds a BA and a BA honors in sociology from the University of Fort Hare, a master's from the University of Natal, and a doctor of philosophy from the University of Pretoria. So here we go, Professor.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson. Just to greet the President, yourself, Chair, and the members of the board of IAU, and thank you for the opportunity that you've granted me to speak today on this question of the transformations in the area of teaching and learning. This is what we are all up to, basically, from the type of work that we do as universities. But I just want to say that I'm going to be using the lens, of where I'm hailing from, that is the continent of Africa. And for that reason, whatever I'll be saying will resonate much more with those who hail from the south, because I get a sense that from the colleagues who are hailing from there, particularly as a result of historical factors, there is quite a lot that will immediately be obvious to you more than anything else. So as universities, we are all pressured, to prepare our graduates, for the requisite knowledge and skills, that are required in the world of work. But in doing so, the ethical and social responsibility is actually fairly critical if one begins to think about the workforce of the future, which is fairly transient. I'm saying this largely as a result of the opaque nature of the future that they are going to be inheriting. And the drivers in this instance is the ongoing technological and digital innovation and advancement associated with the shaping global society. I like this point of a revolutionary manner that actually features in the process, because what happens in this instance is that we are finding a situation where these kinds of changes that are currently underway are not simply just happening in an evolutionary manner, but fairly revolutionary, because you don't choose, you basically just find yourself having to take that leap, otherwise you fall behind. And then we are experiencing these global demographics that are changing fairly rapidly as well. And then there's the associated global, concern around sustainability of our planet. This is a matter that we've been talking about, since our arrival here. It's a fairly critical one, because at the backdrop of the work that we do, the question that consistently arises and is horrifying is what is going to happen to the world in an environment of the irresponsible human beings who take things for granted and are not interested in actually looking after the environment that we find ourselves in. And then we have this codependent and yet increasingly conflicted and profoundly unequal world, where we have the developed part on the one hand juxtaposed with the underdeveloped part that we commonly refer to when we emerge out of underdevelopment to a developing world. And then there's a complex array of higher education stakeholders and role players who are playing a role as well in these changes that we're experiencing. Remember that much as we are looking at higher education as being our own domain, there is much more that is happening outside the contours of higher education that begins to raise numerous questions around what we are doing as higher education institutions and where we're going. So I just want to make reference to this area of the fourth industrial revolution, when it comes to the kinds of graduates that we are producing. While we are looking at this, we are looking at it within the context of the environment, as I said, that is transforming on the one hand, but on the other hand, we are saying that there are benefits that we have to be taking care of. At a competitive level, by the way, because as we work, we don't just do so in a manner where we are doing it in isolation or in a vacuum, but we are working with our own partners, in that particular space. And the question then of governance and ethics become a fairly critical area. I'm saying this once again against the backdrop of what we've experienced in the world. We've discovered that the area of ethics and governance have taken a center stage as well. Because remember that organizations and entities that have found themselves, falling apart in the recent past, it's largely as a result of those areas that have not been taken care of. And what is our role then when it comes to higher education? And I just want to make reference to the World Economic Forum summing up the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I will not be talking much about this one. Safe to say that the most important part is that their understanding of this particular development is where we're looking at it as being inclusive, because it's taking care of virtually everyone else rather than leaving others on the margins, which is a fairly interesting one because it is talking about this development from the Fourth Industrial Revolution as going to be empowering. So that's where the inclusive power then comes to the fore, but also ensuring that those who are hovering on the margins are going to be competing almost on an equal basis. Because if you think about accessing higher education with the affordances of technology at your disposal, you are no longer basically finding yourself in a situation where your exposure is limited by dint of your space where you are hailing from, but rather the fact that you can be exposed to any professor from anywhere else who actually is fairly competent in the field, which is actually fairly unique as a result of these kinds of developments. So I will not go into detail, but rather that from my presentation, you can get into the detail of the work that they are talking about in this instance. Now, the advances that are mentioned here are merging the physical, digital, and biological worlds in a manner that is creating both a huge potential on the one hand, but also peril on the other, because if we don't care to actually take the responsibility in this instance, we are finding a situation where the opportunities that are associated with this development from our technological elements is helping us to advance. But if we are not necessarily handling it with care that is desired, you will find that we'll find ourselves on our knees. There is a recent talk that I've heard where we've actually been exposed to the fact that much as the world may not necessarily be preparing itself on what is actually happening as a result of us being exposed to the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the opportunities associated with that, we are not preparing ourselves for that kind of a reality. So the question that arises is, if as universities and any other higher education institution or research institution, we are preparing those for the future of work, which is currently opaque, what do we do currently if there is no defined parameter on what is going to be happening in the future? So to what extent then do we produce graduates who can adapt in that environment regardless of how their training has actually been structured? So these are things that we have not even begun to think about. So we are saying that more than we are talking about 4IR being just technology-driven change, that's an opportunity to everyone, including our leaders, policymakers, and people from virtually all walks of life, rather than being exclusive. So the opportunity that we need to be talking about here is the one that is actually bring about this positive change to everyone else that you can find. So on the question then of transformation in particular here, on the drivers, the very first one is the contextual relevance and responsiveness. In this area, I'm looking, strictly speaking, in the area of our own paradigms, where we have to think carefully about what our own higher education or knowledge base has been, that with our inheritance, which has actually been largely within the frame of colonized, what has happened
to the kind of knowledge that we have inherited. And therefore, if we're in this space, we are talking about our own knowledge systems as being subjugated in the space where the knowledge canons that are inherited from anywhere else are viewed as being superior. And those that are supposed to be our own inheritance are viewed as being inferior. So what then do we do in this particular space? We have to then say there has to be intellectual interrogation so that we don't also take our own and argue that we actually are going to be uncritical and accept it as it were without juxtaposing it within the gaze of knowledges generally. So that when we talk about knowledges, let's talk about Western knowledge canons, let's talk about Oriental knowledge canons, let's talk about our own knowledge systems within our own continent that we'll refer to as indigenous knowledge systems. What this actually does is that when you expose those that you train, you are giving them a fatal environment where they can compare. And it strengthens them rather than that parochial nature that says that this is the only one that you inherit, and therefore you have nothing else to be looking up to. And then we need to then be looking, strictly speaking, at the type of graduates that we are producing who are going to be socially aware, responsive, and critical citizenry that are endowed with the ability to think and question critically, because we don't want to produce robots who are going to be simply just finding themselves, in the world uncritically and just assuming that all is well, because that will actually then not help society to grow. The question of multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity is actually fairly critical and relevant when it comes to the way in which we prepare our teaching materials and courseware for our own students. And I just want that next point on the question of the bespoke design compulsory signature courses for the non-academic educational imperatives, so that our students can be exposed to modules on ethics, on ethical governance, on sustainability, even if they may not be the core modules of what you're supposed to be offering in your particular area. But students must be exposed to these opportunities as well. The epistemological diversity that has to be seen within our own world of centricity. I will not delve into detail on this one because the first partner spoke on this one fairly extensively. So I will actually then just defer to what he has shared in this particular instance, and then want to then rush you to the next one, re-evaluating, rethinking, renewing, and redesigning pedagogy and didactics. This one is fairly critical in my view because we have to look at the quality and effective curriculum transformation, which must be accompanied by the methodologies that are pedagogical within various disciplines. The consideration on the design must be cognizant and critically interrogating the invisible and the marginalized groups, including racial, gender, religious, and cultural minorities, removing these pedagogical and classroom hindrances. And I'm glad about this point because it actually resonates fairly clearly with what my partner has just shared. He's a psychologist, and I'm none closer to that. But the reality is that this is actually the reality insofar as the pedagogy is concerned, which is fairly critical when one begins to look at the successes that we may be hoping for. And we must be open and willing to harness affordances of technology in this instance so that we can provide equal access to the necessary instruments of learning. Inquiry, teaching, and learning, which must balance the traditional assessment with other modes of assessment, so that we don't simply just find ourselves immersed within the old and not exploring the new and giving opportunities on something that we've never explored before. So we have to ensure inclusive, safe, and nurturing environment for students, which will facilitate these positive and productive learning experiences. And he has just spoken about that from a psychological point of view. And I just want to emphasize that point once again, because it brings about a huge level of confidence on the students that you are training within your own classroom setup. And then the next one, locating curriculum transformation within institutional transformation, is a very interesting one because it involves concerns about academic freedoms and institutions of autonomy, where we have to think about the maintenance of the brand status and reputation of the university, against the backdrop of our own inheritances. What is it that we have inherited which actually becomes a hurdle for the students to make success within their own studies? If you find that within the space and the presentation of the very same existence of the university is the one that actually pushes those away from the university, how then do you attract them to the same institution that does not in any sense produce an identity that in a way brings them closer to that university environment? So these are kinds of issues that we need to looking at. But now to conclude, as universities we must survive and thrive, but we must know that we have no other option but to reinvent ourselves. This subject actually came up earlier from the very first speaker in the panel, but we must be doing this within the context of future-centric mindset that is inclusive of multi-stakeholder, broadly participative leadership and management, collaborative business models, a fundamental commitment to sustainability through ethical stewardship of our own institutional and planet resources, a genuine appreciation of the people who comprise the university community, the quality and relevant coursework, the assessment practices and student support that will prepare graduates for this uncertain future, but will provide a foundation for their future flourishing. You know, because of these uncertainties, we can't simply just sit on our laurels and say we can't do anything about the future. But we must actually be preparing for that future in a manner that is designed to understand that that flexibility will have to guide the way in which this future product will have to adapt in the environment where they will be finding themselves. And then thank you very much with all the languages that you'll find within the confines of the space where I'm coming from. Once again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I think we have some time for one or two questions. Yes. Otherwise, if I will be having so many questions, we will be forgetting lunch, and I don't think so. We want that. So, one or two questions, Pam.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. I think it brought very good things to the table. I have a question, and that is, it is actually to the online courses and using the distance learning. Because you all bring up the critical thinking, the way of the students to be meeting the future, how to be the developer, not today, but also in the future. So how do we get the critical thinking, which is usually based on seminars and discussions, into the online courses? And also the perspectives of that the students are so different. And you meet with one course produced with one pedagogical idea.
Whom do you want to address that, Pam? To the panel? Anyone? Okay, who would want to answer that?
No, thank you very much. We appreciate that question. Just to say quickly that there is an advantage with online education that you will not find under normal circumstances. Because the manner in which you prepare your courseware is such that you are not doing it single-handedly, but what you do is that you have an opportunity of participation just beyond yourself as a professor in that particular discipline. So you'll be having a number of other partners with you who will eventually assist that by the time the material has been produced and is ready for consumption, we can say that it actually comes from the hands of a team-approached, driver. So we find that the reflections that are actually contained then in the materials are far more advanced, comparatively speaking. But secondly, that within the context of the work itself, that the content will actually be presented, but at the same time, you will find that all these other components about the extent to which you want to find the students that you produce at the end of the day having this litany of the kinds of attributes
is going to be built in a manner in which you have structured your study materials, because it has to be self-contained. So those are things that you do up front. So by the time they actually take the material, they already have that particular opportunity. But secondly, that while they are exposed to the materials that you are offering, you then bring, the opportunity to the same students that comes from a wide variety of disciplines, who can then be participating as the support base for those students. So they may not necessarily be coming from the same discipline, but may be coming from different disciplines. Theirs is to support students on what perhaps we may refer to as a psychosocial support. Because in many instances, you might find that students are not making progress, not because they do not have the brain power that is required in that subject domain, but the environment that has produced them has already put some limits in the exposure that they require. So by then putting them with that kind of a space, you already give them the exposure that they will not necessarily be having in the environment where they will be just walking in a classroom, and here I am as a professor, because that limited space within which we are doing the work is simply them as opposed to me. Whereas in that online environment, the opportunities are far wider.
I'll just make a comment. I'll try to, my thing keeps cutting in and out, but you all can hear me, I guess, okay? So even though I call myself a clinical psychologist in recovery, I still am a psychologist. And so when I hear a term like critical thinking, I'm always inclined to try to understand, well, what do we mean by the term itself? How do we operationalize this? How do we measure it? From our perspective, one way to think about critical thinking is in terms of attributional sophistication. So when the comments that were just made are a perfect illustration of how we internalize notions about reality. This is how reality is. This is who I am. This is who you are. This is how the world works. We go into learning environments, whether they're online or classroom-based or whatever, with those assumptions inside us without even knowing that they're there. So one way to deal with the question is to use whatever method you want to use. We use this measure called the Bevy, but there are lots of other excellent methods and approaches to get students even to understand that they have those things, that they've internalized that. That's one thing to do. Another thing to do is to juxtapose the attributions that I say I have with the attributions that other people have, the beliefs, the values that people have. Create active spaces where there's not competition or argument. There's reflection about why. Why is it that I have these beliefs and values that I do, in order to create that kind of safe, nurturing space for that type of reflection to occur. We do that with Collaborative Online International Learning, COIL, and there are modules that can do this just as effectively and sometimes more effectively, because you're working asynchronously and synchronously with cultures around the world. So attributional sophistication is one of the ways we will equip the next generation to be able to be open to the opportunities and challenges and people that are out there. That would be my comment.
Let me add a couple of things here. As instructor for online courses, I can do nothing but agree with my panelist judgments on this. It is a challenging task to include the students in the whole learning process, but my comment will go to the institutional perspective, that as instructors we know more or less what to do, how to involve the students in this learning process, but the institutions, that the universities themselves, the administrations seem to not understand the value of this process, that they are more interested in learning the software and the learning platform because they want to know, hey, how much it's going to cost, from their perspective, it's understandable. But from my perspective, we have to put the emphasis on the student rather than the cost of the learning platform and the software and so on and so forth.
So with that, there's another question, Andrew? Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, so I have a question for Craig. First of all, thanks for a very nice talk. But in terms of the conclusions you've come to around teaching and learning, and thinking particularly in a higher education context, your studies seem to have been done of language learning. Now, No, maybe I got the wrong end of the stick there. But it seems to me that much of what we're teaching at universities is about critical thinking. It's about evidence, using an evidence base, working from the evidence base and coming to conclusions. So within that context, the backgrounds of the students, as you've described them there, become somewhat less relevant. That would be my take on it. So perhaps you could comment in terms of the studies you've done in more, let's say, rigorous scientific disciplines, perhaps maths, physics, and the learning and how the emotional factors that you outlined impact on learning in those types of areas.
Oh, perfect. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I had 15 minutes to describe literally 25 years of work. So the English language acquisition is just one variable of dozens of variables we've looked at, maybe 50, 60 variables that we've looked at to see how these internal processes interact and produce change or whatever. Grade point averages, for example. But to your point on critical thinking, one set of analyses we did, for example, shows a clear linkage, and for all the educators and administrators or policy people in the room who are trying to find data to make the case for the goodness of what we do in higher education, we have some data that show, for example, that the more years, it's actually broken down by months, the sheer number of months of being in a higher education setting is associated with several scales that measure critical thinking. More critical thinking, now there are all kinds of potential confounds of maturational variables and these kinds of things. So there's plenty of data, though. I confidently can say that education, if it's done right, and even if it's done okay, and sometimes even badly, does tend to produce a higher degree of sophistication in how we make meaning of the world. So I would say that. There's one other comment I was going to make. I'm sure it was absolutely necessary, but it's lost I've lost it, so I'll let it go. Yeah, there we are.
The two rooms have been finished, so I think we are under pressure now. So thank you very much for being with us. We can continue the discussion during lunch. So thank you, Dr. Tolga, Professor Macania, Dr. Shelley. Thank you so much. And please don't forget your ear set. Leave it.